There was a quiet kind of order in her life before the fight began, an illusion of peace that hid behind trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes, a neighborhood that measured worth in symmetry and silence. She moved there because she believed in fresh starts, the kind that smell like morning dew and paint thinner from a newly finished porch. She wanted to heal, to find calm after a year that had nearly broken her. The HOA brochure had promised serenity, manicured lawns, safe streets, friendly neighbors, but buried in its polite legal language was one rule that would soon shatter everything. No pets. At first, she hadn't cared. She wasn't a pet person then. She was someone trying to keep her head above water. But trauma doesn't follow the rules of planned recovery. It lingers. It claws. It finds new ways to surface when life seems settled. That was when the panic attacks began. Short breaths that came without warning. Nights where silence became unbearable. Her therapist had suggested a service animal. Not for companionship, but for grounding. A living, breathing tether to reality. She found him at a shelter 2 towns away. A golden retriever with eyes that seemed older than his body. Calm, intelligent, unwavering. His name was Milo. From the first moment, he seemed to know. Training him became therapy itself. Every command, every routine, a step away from fear. He wasn't a pet. He was a lifeline, a medical necessity given fur and heart. But the HOA didn't see it that way. They saw a violation. A letter arrived, polite, firm, absolute. Remove the animal within 7 days or face fines. Her hands shook as she read it. She could almost hear the hum of the street outside, the sound of conformity waiting to close in. She called, explained, pleaded. They cited rules, not empathy. She cited law, not rebellion. The Fair Housing Act and ADA made service animals an exception, but the HOA board wasn't used to being corrected, especially not by a woman they considered new. The next letter wasn't polite. It was a notice of violation. They had taken photos. Milo sitting on the porch, leash in sight, evidence of disobedience. She felt her old anxiety returning, not from panic this time, but from injustice. That subtle trembling of someone realizing peace isn't given, it's defended. Days turned into weeks. Fines accumulated. Whispers spread. Neighbors avoided eye contact, afraid of association. The HOA president, a retired attorney named Whitmore, made it personal. He told others she was exploiting a loophole. But she wasn't looking for loopholes. She was following the law. And for the first time since moving there, she began documenting everything. Dates, letters, emails, the tone of every conversation. It wasn't fear anymore, it was resolve. Because she knew something they didn't. Silence only protects bullies. And this time, she wouldn't be silent. The next part of the story begins when she decides to fight back. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. When she walks into the courthouse with Milo at her side, and the HOA realizes they've picked a battle they can't win. When she first moved in, the HOA had seemed harmless. Potlucks, newsletters, neatly typed minutes from board meetings that spoke of community and harmony. It was easy to believe the rules were there for order, not control, until the day a rule was turned against her. The letters kept arriving. Stiff paper, official language, a tone that suggested authority more than law. Each envelope felt heavier than the last. A reminder that power, when unchecked, can masquerade as civility. Milo didn't understand the tension. He only sensed her heartbeat quicken when she opened the mail, the way her hands trembled as she stacked fines on the kitchen counter. He pressed against her leg, steady and warm, the dog's quiet presence grounding her in a world that suddenly felt hostile. She researched, nights spent scrolling through legal forums, reading federal housing statutes, learning phrases like reasonable accommodation and protected status. The law was clear. A service dog wasn't a pet. It was a necessity. But clarity doesn't always defeat arrogance, and the board's arrogance ran deep. Whitmore believed rules defined the neighborhood's worth, that compliance was a reflection of control. He saw her as defiance wrapped in politeness, a threat to order. Meetings became stages. Whispers turned into public discussions thinly veiled as concern. She attended one, standing quietly at the back, listening as her name was mentioned without mention, as certain residents were discussed with pity and irritation. That night, she filed her first official complaint with the city's fair housing office. It wasn't a declaration of war, it was a line in the sand. The investigator assigned was calm, methodical, asked for documentation, correspondence, any record that could show intent. She had everything, every letter, every timestamp, every dismissive email. For the first time, the burden of proof felt lighter. Weeks passed, spring crept into the neighborhood. Flowers bloomed in perfect symmetry along identical driveways. Yet tension grew like a weed no one could prune. The HOA sent one last notice, final warning before legal action. She responded with a copy of her complaint number and a simple statement: "The law protects me." That sentence echoed louder than she expected. It moved through the board like wind through glass, silent but unsettling. Whitmore called an emergency meeting. Neighbors gathered, voices rose. Some questioned the board's motives, others defended tradition. The community that once felt uniform began to fracture, cracks forming where compassion should have been. And while they argued, Milo sat at her feet, calm as stone. She didn't realize it yet, but her quiet defiance was changing more than her own circumstances. It was changing how her neighbors saw the rules that ruled them. The conflict would escalate from here. When the investigators arrive, when the HOA realizes the complaint has legal weight, when empathy finally enters the story. The letter from investigator arrived on a quiet Thursday, the kind of day when the air hums with summer heat and sprinklers tick in the distance. It was simple, almost understated, an official notification that a fair housing review had been opened. For her, it meant validation. For the HOA, it meant exposure. Word spread quickly. The same neighbors who once nodded politely across their lawns now glanced with curiosity. Some whispered encouragement. Others looked away, fearing involvement. The illusion of harmony was unraveling, and there was no going back. Whitmore tried to maintain composure, but beneath his calm exterior ran a streak of indignation. He'd built his identity on control, on the idea that rules kept chaos at bay. The notion that someone, especially a newcomer, could challenge that order gnawed at him. He called for another board meeting, this time closed door. But walls, no matter how thick, can't hide fear. Even before the minutes were released, she could sense the tension shifting. The HOA's attorney had warned them that fighting a service animal accommodation could become expensive. They were told, in legal terms, that they might lose. She waited, days stretching into weeks. Her complaint moving through the system, her resolve hardening with each attempt to intimidate her into backing down. Notices still arrived, but now she filed them untouched, photocopied, cataloged, evidence, not threats. One evening, she stood on her porch watching Milo chase the fading light. The air carried the scent of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. For a moment, she felt normal again, free. Then headlights turned in her driveway. A car she recognized, Whitmore's silver sedan. He stepped out, posture rigid, expression caught somewhere between irritation and calculation. He stayed on the sidewalk, careful not to trespass, and left an envelope on the mailbox. She waited until he drove away before opening it. Inside was a new notice, an attempt to redefine the rule, to frame her as non-compliant under a technicality. They claimed Milo's registration papers weren't sufficient, that his presence altered the community's aesthetic. She read it twice, almost laughing at the absurdity, aesthetic, as though compassion could clash with color palettes. That night, she sent everything to her investigator. The next morning, a reply came back, a scheduled site visit. For the first time, the HOA's authority would meet the law face to face. When the day arrived, she stood by her front gate, Milo sitting obediently beside her. The investigator, calm, professional, walked the property, observed, took notes. Whitmore trailed behind, muttering about rules and fairness. The questions were simple, the answers simpler. Was Milo trained to assist? Yes. Was he necessary for daily functioning? Yes. Had the HOA made efforts to accommodate? No. Facts have a way of cutting through arrogance like light through fog. By the end of the visit, Whitmore's voice had grown small. The investigator's tone had grown sharp. Within 2 weeks, the findings were official. The HOA had violated federal accommodation law. They were ordered to cease enforcement and issue a formal apology. But pride doesn't bow easily. Instead of apologizing, Whitmore filed a counterclaim, asserting community disruption. It was a desperate move, and she knew it. She hired an attorney, and when the papers were filed, when her complaint turned into a case, the neighborhood that once whispered now watched in silence. The battle was no longer about one dog or one homeowner. It was about what kind of community they truly were. The courthouse didn't look intimidating from the outside. A simple brick building under an open sky, sunlight spilling over the steps. But for her, walking through those doors felt like crossing into a new chapter, one written not in fear, but in courage. She had never been inside a courtroom before, never sat beneath fluorescent lights, so bright they seemed to erase the color from everything. The sound of shuffling papers and low murmurs filled the air, each noise a reminder that this was real, this was happening. Across the aisle sat the HOA's attorney, crisp suit, calm smirk. Beside him, Whitmore, arms folded tight, his confidence now a brittle shell. Her own attorney leaned close, whispering reassurance, steady, grounded. Truth speaks for itself, he'd said earlier. And that's what they had, truth, documented in months of letters, fines, and denials. When the proceedings began, the HOA's attorney tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, an issue of policy, not prejudice. They claimed consistency in enforcement, argued that allowing one exception could lead to chaos. But chaos was what they'd created. Each piece of evidence turned their narrative into dust. The investigator's report was clear. The HOA had ignored federal law, dismissed medical documentation, and continued to harass despite warnings. Every violation letter became another nail in their defense. She sat quietly as her attorney read aloud excerpts from the Fair Housing Act, phrases she'd memorized in sleepless nights. Reasonable accommodation, equal opportunity to use and enjoy dwelling. Words that once seemed abstract, now sounded like salvation. When her turn came to speak, her voice didn't tremble. She told her story plainly, how Milo calmed her panic attacks, how she followed every procedure, how each letter from the HOA made her feel smaller, unwelcome. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even Whitmore's attorney avoided eye contact. The judge leaned back, pen tapping slowly. His expression softened, neutral but human. Then he spoke. His decision wasn't just a ruling, it was a statement. The HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act and was ordered to pay damages, retract all fines, and undergo compliance training. Her right to keep Milo was protected by law. It was over. But victories in life rarely feel immediate. When she walked out of the courthouse, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt exhausted, hollowed out by months of tension. She sat in her car, Milo's head resting on her lap, and for the first time in a long time, she cried, not from fear but from release. Back home, the neighborhood looked unchanged, the same hedges, the same driveways. But the silence was different now, no longer oppressive, just still. Days later, she received the HOA's official letter of apology. It was short, formal, and personal. Yet between the lines, she saw what mattered. They had bent, finally, to something larger than themselves. Whitmore resigned. The board appointed new members, people who believed in compassion over control. Neighbors who had once avoided her began stopping by. Some offered congratulations, others simply smiled. The walls of isolation that the HOA had built around her were crumbling. And through it all, Milo remained her constant, steady, patient, a living emblem of what resilience looks like when tested. The neighborhood began to change in subtle ways. More open conversations, fewer whispered judgments. Someone even suggested revising the rulebook entirely, removing the blanket ban on pets, replacing it with a clause on service and emotional support animals. It wasn't just her victory anymore. It was the community's awakening. But the most powerful moment came weeks later. She was walking Milo near the park when a young mother approached. Her son, quiet and withdrawn, clung to her hand. The mother explained, softly, that her son had autism and they were considering a therapy dog, but she'd been afraid of HOA rules. Her eyes welled up as she spoke. And for the first time, the homeowner understood what all the months of struggle had been for. Not just her peace, but for others who would come after. When she returned home that evening, the sun hung low, painting the streets gold. Milo trotted ahead, tail swaying like a flag of quiet victory. She stood for a moment at the edge of her porch, breathing in the stillness she had earned. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the right to live in peace, without fear, with a companion who saved you. Epilogue, the reflection. The story spread slowly through the community, then beyond, a tale not just of defiance, but of grace under pressure. It reminded people that rules are meant to serve, not suffocate, that empathy has a place even in the fine print of governance. She no longer flinched when the mail arrived. She no longer feared meetings or memos. The HOA had changed, but so had she. She had learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. Milo, ever watchful, lay by the window as she wrote her final letter to the Fair Housing Office, thanking them not just for the ruling, but for reaffirming something deeper. That home isn't defined by walls or contracts. It's defined by belonging. HOA USA Stories. Because sometimes the smallest victories rewrite the biggest rules.